So, okay, let's start. So you teach and work in philosophy of physics. So
Yes.
how would you describe the general aim of your subdiscipline to an outsider or non-academic?
The general aim of philosophy of physics or of my research specifically?
As you wish. Maybe a little bit about the general aim and then about your research in specific.
Okay, so yeah, I guess there are sort of two things that philosophy of physics does. There's like taking from philosophy and helping physics, I guess. So you look at things that physicists are worrying about or struggling with or thinking about or conceptual issues within physics and take a kind of philosophical approach which might help contribute or make sense of what's going on specifically in that area of physics, maybe with an aim to clearing up issues that are relevant to physicists' work, relevant to the development of physical theories in various different ways. So that's like one aspect. And then there's the kind of counterpoint, which is doing the taking from physics for philosophy. So when philosophy is interested in these broader metaphysical questions about what there is and what time is like and what space is like and what the world is fundamentally like and all those kinds of questions, then physics clearly has a great deal to contribute to answering those questions. And so being a philosopher who knows about physics is a useful and good thing to do. Like there are kind of ways in which I can contribute to philosophy. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Those two kind
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so more like in naturalized metaphysics than like the detached metaphysics
right
in the ivory tower. Yeah.
Yeah. So bringing physics to metaphysics, but also bringing epistemological or conceptual tools to physics.
Yeah. Okay, and so I take it that one of your jobs is like to interpret the implications of physical theories and how we think about them and what stories they tell us about the world and all the conceptual issues.
Right.
Do you think this has any implications on the actual way we are doing science?
Look, I mean, I don't know if there's the way we do science might be a bit broad, but I think that when I look at kind of theoretical physics, particularly right now, it's kind of cliche to say there's a crisis in theoretical physics, like really fundamental. I mean, condensed matter physics may be different, but okay, so I think that an awareness and a focus on things like the quantum measurement problem is relevant to the way in which physics should proceed and does have implications, and the kind of foundational thinking that one finds philosophers doing has implications for the way in which one should develop and extend fundamental physics. It's also got experimental implications. So there are kind of, and I'm not saying that philosophers are the only ones who worry about the measurement problem, but philosophers have seemed to be the people who focus on that more than some aspects of physics, and that's part of a push, I guess. And I don't want to make a kind of sociological claim that I don't think I necessarily have the evidence for, but there's a general interest in developing particular interpretations of quantum mechanics and experiments that can differentiate and distinguish between the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and some of those are motivated more philosophically. I think that one can also look at the foundations of quantum gravity communities, and people do seem there to be genuinely interested in engaging with philosophers, talking about what it can mean for space-time to be emergent, those kinds of questions that are of genuine interest to physicists, and philosophers might be able to contribute in interesting ways to those kind of questions. When this has something to do with what I think about, I mean, I've spent a bit of time thinking about this concept called naturalness that people use in high energy physics. So it's kind of distinct from the philosopher's conception of naturalness, but involves the ideas, it's closely related to the idea of fine tuning, the idea that concepts defined at sort of one energy level should be somehow autonomous or free floating or independent from quantities defined at other energy levels. So specifically, one shouldn't expect the particular parameters that I find in my physical theory at, say, 10 to the minus 5 meters. Those particular parameters shouldn't absolutely and totally constrain the parameters defined at 10 to the minus 10 meters. Those, I mean, if we've got very, very different length scales, then we should expect the kind of goings on at each length scale to be somehow autonomous from each other.
Yeah,
that's the kind of natural expectation, and that expectation goes under the name of naturalness. And this has been a guiding idea within high energy physics. So a lot of high energy physicists talk about the need for something like supersymmetry, and they talk about the hierarchy problem, and they talk about various other problems. And part of their justifications for thinking that we need to extend theoretical physics in this particular way is that this kind of issue of naturalness should really worry us. And personally, I'm kind of skeptical of that. I don't think that that might be the right way to push. I don't think that there's like a good philosophical justification for thinking that the world ought to be natural. I get the intuition, but I don't see the precise philosophical motivation for it. And as such, I think that perhaps this kind of aspect of theoretical physics might be badly motivated. Which is not to say that we shouldn't do it at all, but I think that understanding the motivations of the different aspects of physics might help in making decisions about which research strategies to pursue. So there's a kind of fairly limited sense in which an understanding of the details of the physics and a kind of more abstract philosophical analysis of the sort of thinking and the research strategy and the methodology underlying certain approaches to aspects of physics can be informed by that sentence ended up being much too long. Can go back and inform what we do in theoretical physics.
Yeah. So I take it you are in the camp that is like critical of these naturalness conceptions, which are implicitly often being criticized as being nothing more than just beauty standards. Like Sabine Hossenfeller comes to mind. She's very famous for like calling them out and rejecting that we should build another collider because just based on these principles there should be other particles appearing, and the predictions have gone wrong the last time. So actually I'm a fan of Sabine Hossenfelder's. I'm not sure that I don't feel myself in a position to kind of make a particular set of claims about whether or not there should be a next collider. That's not, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the specific question and the specific trade-off and the politics of particle physics funding bodies and all of that. But I think that insofar as she's making a kind of particular theoretical claim, I'm on board with that. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to pick up another issue you just mentioned. So the traditional story goes that physicists were very interested in the measurement problems and the interpretations of quantum mechanics like in the first half of the 20th century. And then there was this attitude of more like shut up and calculate in the second half. And you're thinking that physicists returning to the problem right now, that's your impression? you said you don't want to make any sociological claims.
Yeah, yeah. I just so there are. I mean, in context like this, I become particularly aware that a lot of my views sort of go over into empirical claims that I just don't have the facts to back up. I have the general impression that it's less it's less dangerous, sort of career-wise, for a physicist to say that they mind, and particularly in quantum information communities, quantum foundations communities, there are bunches of physics dotted around who do seem to care about this. Whether or not that's changed particularly, I mean, well, clearly these kind of new communities of physicists didn't exist 30 years ago. So there's going to be some change there, but I don't know. I listened to Sean Carroll's podcast, and one of his episodes, he said that a colleague of his told him not to mention sort of his philosophical interest in a grant application. So there still seems to be some kind of gatekeeping within physics. But my impression is that it's less bad than it was, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, actually, I enjoy Sean Carroll's podcast as well. Yeah. So when we are at the interpretations of quantum mechanics, do you have a favorite interpretation?
I mean, I don't know what my credence in it is, but I think, yeah, probably the Everett interpretation, because I mean, I don't want to believe it, but I take the David Wallace line very seriously that right now the presentation of the different interpretations as empirically equivalent is somewhat disingenuous. So it's not the case that we have like a full quantum theory for Bohmian approaches or for spontaneous collapse approaches. We do, however, have a full quantum theory. We can do quantum field theory, we can do other aspects of quantum mechanics in the sort of Everettian framework in a way that we just can't yet. We may be able to at some point, but right now there aren't fully developed interacting relativistic quantum theories for the sort of putative rivals to the many worlds interpretation.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that, yeah, we won't be able to do it at some point, but right now it's not a fair competition. We've got one that works in all these cases, and caveat, you might worry about probability and might think that it doesn't work at all. But if we think that we can satisfy those kind of objections, then it looks like we've got an approach which works, and it doesn't have right now any good rivals. But I spent a while thinking quite a lot about these kind of backwards causation type approaches. They're really attractive to me. I think they're kind of beautiful, but I also don't think they've been properly worked out yet either. Maybe there are kind of good reasons why they couldn't be worked out, because coming up with a theory that properly includes backwards causation might be just beyond our capacities as scientists.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, having said all that, so that's kind of my favorite, I guess. But
yeah, so you already guessed my follow-up question. I wanted to ask you about probability and Everett interpretation. So, because I have no university level physics background, or not really, so I always wanted to ask an expert about which role, how we can make sense of probability in many worlds. I take it like from the inside, you can calculate how likely an outcome will turn out, and this is the Born rule, roughly, as far as I understand it. But like you always end up that there's a bunch of worlds in which the Born rule is like falsified over and over again, and you don't have this quantum phenomena. And at the end of the day, you need to say that every outcome is equally real because it exists in some world. So how can you talk about probability in that framework? I always found it very puzzling.
Okay, so I should again say that I'm not an expert on this. I don't research about the probability problem specifically, though I do have thoughts about it. So I'm quite persuaded by this line of thinking that says what we're doing in physics is we're uncovering the structure of the world, or like the way the world, sorry, I didn't mean that in like though maybe the kind of structural realist way is the right way to think about that, but I wasn't trying to, just like the way the world is, you know? And some of that involves revising our concepts that we picked up in kind of non-theoretical, non-scientific scenarios. And so if we think about our concept of probability, that came about in, it was developed in gambling context. It was developed in particular settings where we only see one outcome and we expect, there's a range of possible outcomes and then only one of them comes about. And then we develop our way of thinking about probability in that way. And now physics can come along and it can tell us, probability isn't anything like that.
Yeah.
We used to think that probability involves a range of possibilities and just one of them being selected, and now we're wrong. The probability does have this connection to expectations, and it has this connection to how we should weight our particular sort of decision tree in various different ways. It's got these connections to various different other aspects of our thinking. But this connection that says it's got to be just one of these different sort of possibilities has to take place. That I think we might have to revise that. And I think that if the Everett theory is right, then it should force upon us this revision of our concept of probability and tell us that probability is that thing that sort of plays a probability type functional role in the Everett interpretation. So this is Wallace and Greaves and various other people have developed things along these kind of lines, and that the thing that plays that role doesn't involve just one outcome being selected. It involves all of those outcomes taking place. It's just any individual only sees one of those outcomes, and that's fine. And then we end up getting worried, and and the thing that really worries me, and when I think about this stuff, I get stuck here, is the thought that what about those unlucky people who happen to be in that branch of the multiverse that sees all of the really, really unlikely outcomes every single time? So they see we orient our spin measurement apparatus such that 99% are up and 1% are down, and we do 1,000 experiments in a row. So they see the 1% outcome every single time. Now, eventually they're going to conclude that quantum mechanics is wrong and they're going to stop believing in the theory. And that's fine. They're unlucky. And I want to say, okay, well, this looks like a defeater, but then I start thinking about any other different possible approach to quantum mechanics. And then this is going along something like the David Papineau line, which is to say, all approaches to probability have this issue. However one thinks about probability, we could just be unlucky and in an unlikely world, and that would be really bad luck. Like, if we have a spontaneous collapse theory, it could just spontaneously, stochastically, collapse on the really unlikely approach every single time.
The
fact that we expect it not to, that seems to us to be, somehow seems to me to be somehow insufficient to write off the problem in one case, but say, oh no, the problem really bites in the Everett case.
Yeah. That's very interesting, and I'm very sympathetic to this line of thought. So, of course, physics can revise our everyday intuitions about all kinds of things, but that it revises our intuition about fundamental mathematical concepts, that's it's like really revolutionary, you know. Might be a problem for mathematical realists, or yeah.
So no, I don't think it needs. So maybe you again. I don't think that we're not revising. I'm not saying that we should come up with a version of probability that doesn't satisfy the Kolmogorov axioms. Once decoherence has, like, you know, effectively occurred, the modular square amplitude satisfies those axioms in exactly the right way. We're not revising a mathematical concept. We're revising the theoretical interpretation of probability that is associated with that mathematical concept.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. It revises the way we think about probability,
right,
even in other contexts. Yeah.
Right.
So, but yeah, you're not researching directly on that, so maybe we should go on. So during your PhD, you worked on the relationship of physics and other less fundamental so-called special sciences. So how do you understand this relationship? In particular, referring to the paper you have on your website called "Why Aren't All Scientists Physicists?"
Oh, yeah, that's a kind of popular thing. Well, I mean, okay, so look.
Yeah, I couldn't read your whole PhD thesis like in advance. Yeah.
Wait, so did you have a specific question about this, or were you just?
No, I just wanted to get your overall view how the sciences are related and about different levels of emergence and all of these fancy philosophical stuff.
Okay, so I'm a slight I realize that I'm spending a lot of my time saying that I'm not sufficiently qualified to be able to talk about this, but I just feel like, you know, I'm not qualified to talk about anything. What do I think? My PhD research was about the relationship between different theories within physics primarily, and then like an a priori philosopher, I just assume that all of the rest of the sciences are somehow related to each other in the way that physics is related to other bits of physics. And then I, you know, from time to time I learn bits of other sciences, and it seems to me that they can fit into this story, but there are subtleties there about which I should in general be more careful. So I take seriously and want to defend something like a reductionist viewpoint, which says that not that, you know, every other science is logically deducible from fundamental physics, as like old school reductionism is generally caricatured, but a more subtle, I guess, kind of reductionism, which basically says that we can explain, using the resources given to us by some kind of lower level or more fundamental physical theory, or lower level or more fundamental scientific theory of any kind, we can explain why it is that we've organized the world in the way that we have at the less fundamental level. So I think that what we do in science in general is we come up with a bunch of variables which represent or correspond to the salient or most important degrees of freedom in our system. And we look at their relations, the dependencies between those different degrees of freedom or variables. And so each one of those, the ones that work, the ones that are the right way to carve up our system at the higher level, each one of those degrees of freedom and the dependencies between them will be robust, in the sense that they're fairly stable given a bunch of like perturbations and changes at the lower level. So the way Fodor describes this is like you've got all these micro level toings and froings, and you've got macro level kind of patterns of stability. And what I think the reductionists can specifically do is they can do two things. One is they can kind of explain or account for the dependencies at the higher level. If you've got this thing that makes this thing happen, and you've got a kind of stable dependency between this thing and this thing, then that that stable dependency can be derived or explained or something from the bottom up. There will be some bunch of stuff arranged in the right kind of way at the bottom level which make this thing relate to this thing. And I think the second thing we can do, and I really claim that this is quite general, is that we can, from the bottom up, explain the robustness of those degrees of freedom. So we can account for which is the right way to carve up our system, why that way to carve up the system works particularly well, and the dependencies at the higher level. And I think when we've got that, we've like closed all the explanatory gaps. So I don't think there are kind of any explanatory gaps left. But I don't think that that means then that the higher level description is redundant or to be got rid of, or in some sense the higher level stuff isn't real. So I think it is real and it's not redundant. But what I think is that the reason it's not redundant is because the ways in which we coarse grain or throw away or discard lower level details, that allows us to come up with what we should call at the higher level a novel arrangement, a novel organization, a novel way of putting stuff together. And that's what makes the higher level description non-redundant, that it's a new and that it's robust and that it's stable in a bunch of ways that if you're just looking at the lower level description alone, without taking into account the ways in which stuff clumps itself together, you would fail to kind of see exactly, unless you really pay very close attention to how the stability comes about. And that sounded slightly circular as I got to the end.
Yeah, it made sense. So you would adopt some kind of pluralist realism that is like if you have certain levels of descriptions, and in this description there are certain entity or structural claims made, and then the bits that are referred to, you would be realist about them. Is there a difference? Would you be more realist about, I don't know, biological species than social structures, or more realist about fundamental physical entities than about things we encounter in our everyday life? Even
okay, good.
If these theories are relatively robust, yeah.
So, a priori, no. I don't see any reason to be more realist about one level than another. In fact, like epistemologically, then, like, I think that our warrant for scientific realism is probably better in fundamental physics than it is at higher levels. But then on the flip side, I don't think that anything could ever happen to make us reject I don't know, humans as a biological kind, Homo sapiens or something. In the world right now, I don't think anything could happen to convince us that there's so much of a continuum between human and then sort of our closest biological evolutionary relative that they're really, you know, just the same kind of thing. I think we know enough about it. I mean, like, it was not the best example, but I'm just thinking, like, there are things that we know about not purely through scientific means, which might make higher level, some higher level entities ones that we can be really, really confident about. But in general, I guess our warrant for realism is better when we've got like more quantitatively precise scientific description.
Yeah. So you're adopting some kind of nuanced reductionism with some realist element that allows for something like weak ontological emergence. So what would you say to people who claim that there are things that are strongly emergent? Most famous example is probably consciousness. Yeah.
Okay, so I definitely don't want to talk about philosophy of mind.
Okay,
I'm very skeptical of strong emergence in general. In mind case, I think that it's just we just don't know enough yet. Like I just think that like the science of the mind isn't in a good enough position for us to be able to answer either way. And my reason for thinking that is because I think it's very, very, very hard to answer these questions in relatively amazingly simple systems. Like in physics, there are cases in physics where sometimes people talk as if there's a kind of strong emergence. There are cases like symmetry breaking, and there are cases like, you know, phase transitions, or cases where unphysical idealizations seem to be necessary in order to describe our system, and then that corresponds to a kind of explanatory gap. And then sometimes the bold claim is made that that explanatory gap can't be filled. It's not just it hasn't yet been filled, and that's fine, but there are explanatory gaps all over the place that haven't yet been filled. But I think in order to substantiate strong emergence, one needs something like the claim that that explanatory gap is unfillable in principle, and we've got some kind of principled reason to think that it can't be filled. And I guess I have two responses. Firstly, I would just say that that implies some kind of pessimism about the progress that science can make, and like a failure of imagination to think that people wouldn't be able to at some point come up with clever enough ways to get around these purported explanatory gaps. But that's the kind of, you know, that's the wrong kind of way to object philosophically. I think the better way is just to say that in such cases where I've met them in bits of science that I've understood well enough, I think that we can make sense of them. And I think that one of the ways we can make sense of them, particularly with regard to the use of idealizations, is based on reading a lot of Mark Wilson. And Mark Wilson argues that the tools that we have, the mathematical tools that we have for physics, just aren't perfect. They aren't absolutely tuned to the physical needs that we have. And that a lot of doing physics involves coming up with clever tricks in order to fit an imperfect set of mathematical tools to a given physical problem. And at those places of mismatch, we find that idealizations are required. And the fact that idealizations are required doesn't mean that we can't explain why these idealizations are required. It just means that we should understand that the match between our sort of mathematical representation and the physical world isn't perfect. I don't think that's in general grounds for belief in strong emergence. A paper I have with that's just been accepted in BJPS with Vanessa Seifer, we argue that a particular case in chemistry, which people have used to argue strong emergence, is an instance of the quantum measurement problem. And so where there's a kind of explanatory gap between a chemical way of understanding the world and a physics way of understanding the world, and that people have taken that explanatory gap to be like an in-principle one and to imply some kind of strong emergence, we say, no, this is just the explanatory gap that you should expect to have in quantum mechanics because of the quantum mechanical measurement problem. Now, maybe there are strong emergent responses to measurement problem. In fact, I know that there are, but that should at least deflate some of the strong emergent claims where people don't want to go that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I have the same intuition, less sophisticated, but yeah, pretty much the same. So, and also, it's very hard to imagine how a proof that something is strongly emergent would look like, even. Yeah, to say there's an unbridgeable gap and to prove more or less that there's an unbridgeable gap. Yeah. But maybe let's move on to the topic related to your talk you gave yesterday at the department, which is you've recently worked on philosophy of race, and you compared social construction to physical construction. And what do you think we can learn from studying construction and emergence in physics that is relevant for our understanding of race or other social kinds?
Good. It's a good question, and it's a question that's kind of difficult for me to answer because the Q&A and discussion after the talk made me think that I need to revise some of the ways in which I've been thinking about this stuff. So I need to be careful. So part of my view that I've been defending is that we shouldn't be thinking of physics or some more fundamental sciences as the privileged realm of the real. That there's real stuff all over the place and at every level. And I think that these kinds that we use in social science or when describing the world have just as much a claim to be real if their sciences are good and if they play a good role in prediction, explanation, etc., just as much a claim to be real as those kinds in physics. And the ways in which, you know, these levels relate to each other, the ways in which we get, like, you know, a kind of robust or stable higher level property coming out from the lower level in the way that I talked about a little bit ago. That I think can be a helpful way of understanding what goes on in the social world as well, where we've got a huge array of complex properties and interrelations, and in order to navigate the world effectively, we need to abstract, or we need to throw away and discard some of the lower level detail in order to come up with, you know, relatively fewer degrees of freedom to describe the kind of navigable social world. And the patterns that we decipher on that basis of those series of abstractions are going to correspond and be made real by structures that legitimate those kind of abstractions. This is all very, very high level and non-specific so far. So what I then think is that if we find that it makes sense to us, or it works to divide the world up in a particular way, such that, for example, we find robust dependencies or outcomes which reveal certain kinds of racial disparities, for example, then we ought to look in the same way whenever we find robustness at the higher level. I've been suggesting that we can look to the lower level, to the underlying kind of description, and say, what is it that makes that happen? What is it that makes these particular properties the right and the stable ones and the ones that are useful to describe a complex of individuals? And I think that, and what I was arguing in the talk yesterday, that what we mean, or one thing that we mean when we say that race is socially constructed, is that there are underlying structures like the structures of racism and oppression and systematic racial disadvantage in various different contexts. They're the ones that underwrite the salience to us of division interracial kinds. And I think that this is an important, or I hope that this is an important insight, because what it can do is it can make clear to us why it is that it turns out to be the case that lots of people find it useful to understand different people's races in explaining certain kinds of inequitable distribution of resources or outcomes.
Yeah.
So it's building this analogy between what we do in physics, or how I think about physics and emergence, and how I can think about emergence of social kinds. It's something that I'm cautious about and I'm still working on, but I think that there's something helpful about this analogy to kind of unpicking the disadvantage that makes real those kind of high level structures.
Yeah.
High level kinds.
So race is something that emerges out from racist social structures embedded in our system, and understanding these structures helps us to get rid of the problems related.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. So I think we are already 43 minutes on the clock, so I will just end with a fairly open question. So if you had any advice for undergraduate students or people interested in philosophy of physics or science in general, what would it be? Or maybe you can name a book that influenced your line of thought and made you choose philosophy of physics as a major.
Really difficult. I don't feel myself as like the kind of, old established person who can mete out advice. What advice do I have? I don't know about books. I mean, like people, I guess, are very important, and relationships with people are very important. I mean, I think that I'm lucky enough to have had a really good relationship with my PhD supervisor, Eleanor Knox, and her guidance was incredibly important to my development as a philosopher. And so I guess finding a PhD supervisor who you can work well with is really, really important. But I don't know how good a piece of advice that is. I mean, working on something that you find to be fascinating is great. I don't know how much I've just been lucky, but I didn't stop finding philosophy. I've never stopped finding philosophy really fun and exciting, and for my whole life, I've always absolutely loved talking philosophy and engaging in philosophical kind of dialogue and discourse. And I guess if you can find yourself a way of never losing that enjoyment, then you're in a very good place. But like that again isn't advice, it's a kind of personal observation. So yeah, I mean, carry on enjoying it, I guess.
Yeah. Do what you like and stick to it. Yeah. It was a very personal advice, but very general and very true advice, I guess. So thank you very much, and I will stop the recording here.